Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's February 6th, and this past week 1,000 neurologists and researchers got together in San Diego, California for the third annual ACTRIMS Forum. ACTRIMS is an acronym for the America's Committee for Treatment and Research in Multiple Sclerosis, and it's probably the largest MS research conference in the United States. I was at the conference where I had the honor of moderating a research panel of award-winning neuroscientists on behalf of the National MS Society. And while the conference was focused on research, news, and announcements that were largely based in the United States, multiple sclerosis doesn't respect borders. There are more than 2 million people diagnosed with MS around the world, and that's why MS requires a global response. The Multiple Sclerosis International Federation, or MSIF, is an organization that's there to support and coordinate the work of other MS organizations in countries all around the world. And today, my guest on the podcast is Mr. Pierre Beneke, the CEO of the Multiple Sclerosis International Federation. But before we get to Pierre, there are a few other things that you should know about. Dr. Guy Buckle from the Andrew C. Carlos MS Institute at Shepherd Center presented the results of an interesting small study at the ACTRIMS Forum. Dr. Buckle and his team reviewed the medical records of 300 MS patients from 2 different MS clinics in the United States and also sent out a survey to the leaders in MS research and treatment from 10 academic medical research centers across the country. They wanted to measure 3 things. They wanted to know how often neurologists use validated tools to screen their MS patients for cognitive impairment and clinical depression. They wanted to understand the neurologist's perception of the value of formal screening for cognitive impairment and depression. And they wanted to identify the barriers to using these screening tools. So to break that down, these validated tools are simply tests that measure cognitive impairment or depression. What they found was extremely low rates of neurologists actually using validated tools to screen their MS patients. Only 2% for assessing cognitive impairment and just 3% for assessing clinical depression. At the same time, they found that of the 300 patients in the study, 36% were documented to have cognitive impairment and 44% were documented to have clinical depression. Now, when they looked at the survey results from the MS research and treatment leaders in those 10 academic medical research centers, they found that 45% used validated tools to screen their patients for cognitive impairment and 36% used validated tools to screen their patients for clinical depression. And of those MS research and treatment leaders who didn't use validated tools, the reasons given were that they didn't have time to administer and analyze the test results. They hadn't seen evidence that these tools were actually helpful. Insurance companies didn't compensate them for administering these tests. And they preferred to analyze cognitive impairment and clinical depression through loosely structured, informal patient interviews. The study concluded that given the impact of cognitive impairment and depression on someone's quality of life, the validated tools that are available for measuring these symptoms need to be used more regularly by neurologists in assessing their patients' well-being. And if I can offer an opinion here, as informed medical consumers, MS patients should certainly feel comfortable asking their neurologist if they're being evaluated for cognitive impairment and depression, and how they're being evaluated for cognitive impairment and clinical depression. Given these alarmingly low numbers of 2 and 3% of the neurologists who are actually using these validated tools to measure these symptoms, well, it suggests that 98 or 97% of the neurologists aren't using them. Given these statistics, I'm not sure that anyone can just assume that their doctor is using the tools that are available. And given the prevalence of cognitive impairment and depression among MS patients, and how impactful those particular symptoms can be on quality of life, this is a really important question to have answered. And let me also stress, this was a small study, so it may not be indicative of the world at large, but I think the results at least require that we ask those questions when we're with our neurologist. In the past year, Ocrevus has been approved for treating both relapsing remitting and primary progressive MS. At the ACTRIMS Forum, Dr. Laura Balser, a neurologist at New York University Langone Medical Center, presented some of the data from the Phase 3 clinical trial for Ocrevus. Dr. Balser presented data from 2 studies that compared Ocrevus and Rebif in patients with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. Specifically, Dr. Balser presented data that focused on MS patients in the studies who had visual impairment when they enrolled in the clinical trials. Researchers tested those patients' vision every 12 weeks during the study, and at the end of the 96-week clinical trials, they found that the patients in the group being treated with Ocrevus experienced some improvement in their visual function, while the patients being treated with Rebif experienced a mild decline. Based on these results, researchers believe that the findings demonstrate that Ocrevus has the ability to reverse visual impairment in relapsing remitting MS. Last October, we talked about the positive Phase 2 clinical trial results that were announced at ACTRIMS in Paris for the drug Ibutylast in the treatment of progressive MS. Well, at the ACTRIMS Forum, some additional positive clinical data was presented by Dr. Robert Naismith, Associate Professor of Neurology at Washington University School of Medicine, and an investigator in this clinical trial. And Dr. Naismith announced that Ibutylast demonstrated a 26% reduction in confirmed disability progression. Now, Ibutylast has been available in Japan and Korea since 1989, where it's used to treat post-stroke complications and bronchial asthma. Medicinova, the company behind Ibutylast, has several patents on the drug to treat several different diseases, including progressive MS, ALS, and drug addiction. And armed with these very positive results from a drug that's been available elsewhere in the world for the last 29 years, Medicinova is headed to the FDA to get their formal feedback so that the Ibutylast program can be moved forward as quickly as possible. Most everyone living with multiple sclerosis knows that men get MS less frequently than women. And it may turn out that a mistake in a lab could lead to an understanding of why that is. Under a grant from the National MS Society, researcher Melissa Brown and her team at Northwestern University were conducting lab studies to understand the effect of a genetic mutation that prevented female mice from getting a disease that's very similar to MS. But the researchers accidentally used male mice with this genetic mutation, and they saw that the male mice actually developed worse disease. So instead of ignoring the results of this accidental occurrence in her lab, Dr. Brown looked more closely at what the unexpected results might mean, and her team discovered that this genetic mutation knocks out a biological pathway that uses an immune messenger protein called IL-33 that's normally stimulated by testosterone. When females were given this IL-33 protein, they were completely protected from developing this MS-like disease. Dr. Brown's discovery has led to her receiving a new research grant from the National Institutes of Health to further investigate. We've all heard that old saying that the eyes are the windows to the soul. And while that may or may not be accurate, it might turn out that the eyes are the windows to MS. Two different recently published studies demonstrate that by measuring the thickness of the nerve cells in the retina, which is fast, easy, non-invasive, and inexpensive, can actually track MS disease activity. A study from Italy looked at 72 MS patients and found that the thinning of the nerve fiber at the back of the retina correlated with developing new brain lesions and increased disability, and less thinning of this nerve fiber at the back of the retina correlated to no progression in disease activity. So this suggested that checking the nerve fiber at the back of the retina could be a simple measure of disease activity in MS. But one concern here was that there are people with MS who suffer bouts of optic neuritis, and these attacks could also cause thinning of the nerve fiber at the back of the retina. A second study from Spain looked at this specific issue over a period of 5 years and found that while optic neuritis causes temporary periods of accelerated thinning, once the optic neuritis attack stops, the overall rate of retinal nerve fiber thinning is unaffected. So together, these two studies suggest that looking at retinal nerve fibers, the nerve fibers at the back of the eye, could provide a fast, cheap, and non-invasive way to measure the level of MS activity going on in the brain and in other parts of the body, and that could really help guide decisions on treatment. So in this case, the verdict seems to be that the eyes have it. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, the Multiple Sclerosis International Federation brings together MS organizations from all around the world. They strengthen those organizations in countries where there isn't very much support for people living with MS. They work to raise awareness of multiple sclerosis, they provide information, and they support international research in developing better treatments for MS and better ways for people to manage MS. In a moment, we'll be joined by Mr. Pierre Beneke, the CEO of the Multiple Sclerosis International Federation. I remember that right after my wife Jean was diagnosed with secondary progressive MS, the first call we made was to our local chapter of the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, and they immediately connected us with resources so we could better educate ourselves about a disease that, up until that day, we never even thought about. But I can't imagine what that experience would be like if we had been living in a country where there wasn't any support organization for people living with MS. It could easily turn someone's fear into absolute dread. Someone in that situation would feel like they were totally isolated, with literally nowhere to turn. We know that multiple sclerosis doesn't respect borders. It affects more than 2 million people all around the world. My guest on the podcast today is Pierre Beneke, the CEO of the Multiple Sclerosis International Federation, which is sometimes described as an organization of organizations, although I found that they're even more than that. Pierre, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Pierre, as I was introducing you, I mentioned that the Multiple Sclerosis International Federation is sometimes described as an organization of organizations. Can you break that down a little bit and talk about the MS International Federation's mission and its goals?
Yes. Well, our dream is, of course, to work with all the organizations in the MSIF movement, all our member organizations and the others we work with, to end MS one day. In the short term, we really try to bring the world together to work for quality of life and to improve the knowledge about MS, and yes, work towards that dream in the longer term. And in practice, that means that we work with some 50 organizations who have some form of structured membership, and that's from organizations all around the world. So certainly in the US, the National MS Society, but in Western Europe, but also in India, in Mexico, Argentina, and in the Middle East. So we have organizations all around the world, and we try to learn from each other and set objectives together. And those objectives might be in the area of research, understanding the disease. And so we are all about organizations pooling their skills, learning from each other, sometimes pooling their money. So, for example, in the research area, the International MS, Progressive MS Alliance is something that has emerged in the MS-IF movement. And it sits somewhat aside, but it is very much part of the efforts of many of our member organizations, and even more of our member organizations raise funds for that purpose. So we meet with the organization, so the research managers meet and synchronize their strategies for research so that there isn't double work, and they learn from each other how to do the funding of research in the very best way. Another area we work on is access to treatment, and as you said, in many countries it is really difficult. So in China, for example, at the moment, you can't get any reimbursement from the government for an MS drug. So if you're there and you're not pretty wealthy, you're on your own, and that's the same in quite a few other countries. So we work on issues like that and count on the solidarity of the larger organizations to really help us work anywhere in the world on issues such as those. Most importantly, we are here to strengthen each of these organizations. So as an organization of organizations, we want that collaboration. We want the organizations to learn from each other. But we also want to give real support for the very small ones who, if they have the inspiration, if they have the right people, and if they have a bit of luck, can do fantastic things. So we just give them a helping hand, and we have, for example, we have a staff member who deals with the Middle East. We have a staff member who deals with Latin America. And ultimately, every national organization has to do their own work supporting people with MS. But we can lend them a hand, and they can learn from others, and others can learn from them. And last but not least, we try to pool the information about MS. I mean, what you said is you went for advice with your wife to the organizations in the US, which has a wealth of information. So we try to tap the very best information made by our national members and recycle it so that it can be used anywhere in the world. So we translate a lot as well into Arabic or in Spanish, or in the past in Chinese and Russian, to really give those countries where there is much less information and the people with MS and affected by MS in those countries as much advice as they can get.
Well, that is absolutely putting out a lifeline to people who would otherwise be alone and probably pretty scared, not knowing where to turn. So that's an amazing mission. You know, you mentioned the International Progressive MS Alliance, and when I visited the MSIF's website, I read somewhere, and I wrote it down so I'd get it right. It read, quote, "International collaboration changes lives." And regular listeners to the podcast have heard me talk about the International Progressive MS Alliance and the honor that I have to be a member of the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee. Well, in the spirit of full disclosure, I want to let everyone know that Pierre and I know each other because the MSIF is one of the managing members of the Alliance, and Pierre is a member of the Alliance's Executive Committee. Pierre, to me, the International Progressive MS Alliance is kind of a living, breathing example of international collaboration that's designed to change lives. Can you talk a little bit about how you became involved in the Alliance and why or how international collaboration can make a difference in MS research?
Yeah, well, I became involved because very initially, the Alliance really was an initiative of the American MS Society, which convened a think tank, just a meeting with various experts and neurologists and people from patient organizations, talking about, what the hell can we do about progressive MS? It really, because there was, what is happening, and people with progressive MS felt abandoned. You see drug after drug being approved for relapsing remitting, but what about those people who don't benefit from those drugs? So that was the start, and after that seminar, actually, I think it was 4 or 5 of our members came together with us, and we just sat down around the table. I remember it was a round table even, and just said, what are we going to do? That's really the start of what we then called the collaboration. We called it the collaboration because it's okay. We as organizations got to start working together, and in the end, we said, look, it doesn't matter where the best research comes from. Many of the organizations only funded research in their own countries at the time. So in the end, we came to the conclusion, it doesn't matter where the best research is. We got to pool our money, and we got to put it there where the best researchers come up with the best ideas. And if that's outside the countries where we come from and where we get the money from, never mind. People with MS don't care. If it comes from Timbuktu, then the cure comes from Timbuktu. And so we were involved from the beginning in helping to shape that, because it's not easy between national organizations to agree new rules for a common enterprise, to set up common steering committees. The scientists have different ideas, to bring them on board. We have involvement in an advisory way from pharmaceutical companies. That's tricky. You really need to structure that well. You want to stay independent, but you also need their input, because ultimately they are the ones who need to produce the drugs. So we were involved in shaping all that, and in regularly bringing our members together and say, okay, give some input in this enterprise. And last but not least, actually, we have encouraged all our members to contribute financially. So I think at the moment of the 50 organizations we have, 14 or 15 of the ones, particularly the ones with more money, are contributing to the Alliance, which is great. So that in a nutshell is how I got involved and how we are involved. But of course, ultimately the key is bringing together the scientists, the researchers, the medics, who have the insights, who really are the best of the best, who have the insights in developing a strategy of how to tackle progressive MS and take the research forward, speed it up, take away the barriers for research, develop the tools so that you can measure if drugs are effective or not. So that's essential. So in fact, the Alliance is a broad coalition of patient organizations, of other funding foundations, and of the researchers and the scientists, including those in some of the key pharmaceutical companies. And it's a very exciting and hopeful enterprise.
Well, I can certainly underscore that for sure. To change gears just a little bit, back in 2009, the MSIF and its member organizations launched the first World MS Day. And I know this year, 2018, World MS Day is going to be taking place on May 30th. And as we get closer to that date, I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk some more about how the MS community can participate in World MS Day. But I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what World MS Day is and why it was important to create a day of global acknowledgement of multiple sclerosis.
That's a good question. Many organizations have a month or a week or a day themselves, but many organizations don't. And at that time that we launched World MS Day, quite a few organizations said, look, this is a global disease. It doesn't know borders. We actually want something to mobilize, to show that we are not only trying to deal with this in our own country, but that we try to do that together with many others. We want a day as well for people with MS and affected by MS, in a way to celebrate how they cope with it, how they can cope with it, share with each other the sense of being in it together, and the aims of World MS Day are different every year and probably in every organization. So it really is a global framework for national action, for local action. So what we've done is created a logo. We create slogans. Yes, we create background material. We normally set some kind of a theme, but it's for everybody to make use of it how they best see fit at the particular time, but know that it's being done all around the world on the same day and in the same period, because people start campaigning in the lead up to it, and benefit from that sense of global awareness. And it's grown every year. It's very exciting to see. It takes place in more than 100 countries, and it's a crystallizing point in many, many countries, and in small countries, it really gives something to organize around, get people together, and also create awareness in the wider country or the town or locality where local groups or organizations are based. So again, it's a very inspiring exercise, with varying aims from year to year and from country to country. In this year, the aim really is to bring the research and the researchers and people with MS closer together and celebrate. It's not two different worlds; it's one world, and we're tackling MS together.
Well, I couldn't agree more with the aim, certainly. And I think that at the moment that a person is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, no matter how many people are around them at that moment, they feel pretty alone. They ask the classic "why me" questions, and a lot of things run through their mind. And then hopefully those people around them and the organizations that exist are going to fill some gaps and come in and offer the kind of support that person needs. But to me, the really great thing, or I should say one of the great things about World MS Day, is conceptually it reminds everybody, as you said, in 100 different countries around the world, that they aren't alone. That just like MS doesn't respect borders, well, this is a global battle against MS, and there's an awful lot of people, an awful lot of brilliant researchers that you've mentioned that are really dedicated to winning that war. So I think it's terrific from just a support and a unifying point of view that people come together and recognize that while they may be dealing with their own journey in and through multiple sclerosis, there are literally millions of people around them who are fighting the same battle with them. And that's just such a reassuring kind of feeling. Let me ask you, where can people go online to learn more about the MS International Federation?
About the MS Federation, they can go to www.msif.org. And if they want to know about World MS Day, they can go to www.worldmsday.org, although I'm sure on our own website there will be a link to that as well.
Great. Well, Peer, thank you again for talking with us today. I think that people who may have felt that either the battle against MS was local or perhaps even national, maybe you're going to get a better understanding that there really is a global structure in place to bring all the resources of science and medicine together to fight this battle. So thank you for sharing all that with us today.
Thank you very much.
That's going to wrap up this week's edition of Real Talk MS. My name is John Strum. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time.